Hey guys, it's your friendly neighborhood research instructor. I wanted to do just a video. Hopefully I can get it in one. It might take two to go over chapter 2 that you guys can watch before class, and just to kind of go over the chapter and explain a few things to you. So chapter 2 is fundamentals of evidence-based nursing practice. So kind of the background of evidence-based practice. It started out during the 80s is when nursing started really using this research utilization. And so what research utilization means is just they would take research and apply it in different situations and try to use it to see what kind of outcomes they got in different situations. So they would use research intended for one thing and try to move it to something else and use it. From that, it kind of evolved eventually into evidence-based practice. And so evidence-based practice, as you can see on the slide, is basing your clinical decisions on research findings and other factors. So they're related, and like I said, research utilization kind of evolved into evidence-based practice. So the history of research utilization in nursing practice, like I said, in the 80s, they started doing studies that identified, and we've talked about this in class, those of you that had class with me. We talked about in class this knowledge practice gaps or theory practice gaps, where what was being studied was being done by people, faculty, and people that were a little bit separated from actual clinical practice. And so they identified that there's a gap there, obviously. And so they started doing research utilization projects to address that gap. And they developed the Conducted Utilization of Research in Nursing project. And that was in the 70s. And all of those were just to try to close that theory practice gap. So that's kind of how things started. In the 90s, they began to realize that the focus needed to be on evidence-based practice. And so things started kind of changing there into more focus on those clinical decisions and basing those on research findings. So kind of an overview of the evidence-based practice movement. It actually started in England originally with Archie Cochrane, who was a physician there, and who's an epidemiologist actually, and he started putting together these studies into systematic reviews and being able to publish them and disseminate them, and where they would be in a group where you could find them easily. And so that started the Cochrane collaboration, which is still in effect today. And then he proposed this evidence hierarchy that we're going to talk about for weighing evidence and what's more valuable than others. And there's multiple evidence hierarchies out there. And then David Sackett was a Canadian doctor that started this idea of evidence-based medicine. And that's kind of how evidence-based practice began. So the hierarchies that Cochrane, kind of started, they involve ranking evidence according to the strength of evidence. So the stronger the study, the higher it is on the hierarchy. Kind of like you guys should all be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Well, we have multiple different hierarchies for ranking evidence, and I'll show you one on the next slide that we'll be using in this class, and you can see kind of how that looks. Ranking can be variable depending on the type of question being asked, and I'll show you when I show you the hierarchy what that looks like. And then within any level, evidence quality can vary considerably. So just because it's a study that's done at the highest level doesn't mean that it was done well. So you still have to be able to appraise studies and make sure that, okay, even though this is a randomized controlled trial and it's like level 2, this is great stuff, if it was done poorly and the evidence wasn't collected correctly, then it's still a weak study and it's not going to be high on the levels. So here's the evidence hierarchy. So the very highest level you can have is a systematic review. And we'll talk about those a little bit later, but I know we talked about them a little bit the first week, but a systematic review is a collection of a whole lot of articles, and they actually analyze them and put all that data into one, so you have this huge population, huge sample size that you're using, and they're usually very controlled, and it's the highest level of evidence. And then there's a single randomized controlled trial, and this is quantitative study here. So this is where, I'm not going to go into detail about exactly what these are, because we're going to talk about all that later on, but a single non-randomized trial, so a quasi-experimental, and then it goes down from there, with qualitative studies being kind of at the bottom level, and then expert opinions and case reports being at the very bottom. But if you look over here on the side, it talks about, like, for if you're looking for the meaning of something or process type questions, how does this work, then qualitative studies are actually level 2. So it depends on the question that you're asking, really where these are ranked. So best evidence refers to research findings that are appropriate, rigorous, and clinically relevant for answering pressing questions. So you have to have confidence that the evidence is good. And one way to do that is that when you're looking at articles, are they replicatable? Can you take that study and do it over and over and over again and get the same results? And that is a good sign of best evidence if you can replicate that. So some challenges to evidence-based practice. There's 3 main areas that cause issues with evidence-based practice. There's research-related, nurse-related, and then organizational barriers. So research-related, we talked about last week that research is fairly new to nursing. So we don't have a ton of really strong research evidence in nursing at this point. So there's just a scarcity of it. And that makes it difficult to show evidence-based practice because you don't have those abundance of systematic reviews and meta-analysis and those kind of things that give us that really strong evidence that we need. Nurse-related barriers, a lot of times, is just plain unwillingness to use evidence or use research. But another part of that is inadequate skills in locating and appraising evidence. So research isn't taught unless you're at a bachelor's level. And so LPNs and associate degree nurses don't have the skills, and a lot of bachelor's degree nurses don't because this isn't taught well. We're hoping to fix that with this class. But they don't have the skills in how to find and look at the evidence and tell what is good. So, that is a big nurse-related barrier. And then as far as organizational barriers, some hospitals just don't financially support the use of research. They may say they want evidence-based practice and they want research done, but they don't show that. They don't put their money behind their mouth kind of thing. And so it's hard without financial support for nurses to engage in evidence-based practice. So resources for evidence-based practice, what we're going to be looking at a lot in our class are primary studies, and that is studies that are published in journals, and they're not, they haven't been evaluated for quality and use in practice yet. They're evaluated to get placed in the journal, but not an in-depth, this is going to be applicable for practice. And that's actually what we're going to be doing in a lot of our stuff, is looking at studies and appraising them and saying, is this a good study? And you're going to learn how to do that. But for nurses that are out there, working, pre-appraised evidence that's already been looked at is a huge time saver. You don't have to do all these appraisals. You need to know how to do them, but hopefully when you're out there, you have systematic reviews, which is a type of pre-appraised evidence that we use, and they integrate the evidence in a rigorous, systematic way, and we'll talk about the different types in just a second. And then there's also clinical practice guidelines. So it takes those studies that have been done and applies it directly to the bedside. This is what it would look like to do this at the bedside for evidence-based decision making. So systematic reviews, there's two types, and they're quantitative and qualitative. So a meta-analysis is what integrates findings from quantitative studies, and it does it statistically. So it takes all these studies that are the same, and it puts all the data together in a database, and it spits out the numbers, and you have kind of the final. It's almost like doing that initial study on thousands of people instead of a few hundred at a time. And so you get a really good solid base that's very generalizable, remember that word, to the population. A metasynthesis is a qualitative thing. So that's where you take these qualitative studies and you look at the findings and you really focus in on what those main ideas are. But again, like we talked about, qualitative studies are typically a lot smaller samples, so with the metasynthesis you get those larger samples that are a little bit more generalizable. As far as clinical practice guidelines, we don't have a single repository. There's multiple places to find them. One that we'll use is National Guideline Clearinghouse, and it's guideline.gov. But like I said, it's a little tough to utilize when they're kind of all over the place, and you don't really, and a lot of people don't know where to look. And then sometimes there's multiple guidelines for a certain thing, so you have to look at those and identify which ones are the strongest and which ones, from the evidence, you need to be able to look at that and say, this size of this study or this study had this variable that affected the outcome, so I think this one's the stronger study. So, there's different things like that you can look at. The appraisal of guideline research and evaluation is just one instrument that a lot of people use to look at clinical guidelines, and it's kind of like a rubric like you would use in this class, but it's a rubric for looking at clinical practice guidelines and determining if they are strong evidence. And so there's multiple tools out there, but that's just one very popular one, and there's actually access to look at it. If you look in your book, there's a link to go to the website where you can look at that. So I think I'm going to stop this recording here and start the second one. We don't have a lot more to go, but it gets more into kind of the research, and I think this would be a good place to divide it up. So I'll see you on the second recording.